When you look at the wounds that were on the hikers, I'm just not buying the accidental thing.
Why? How come? Why would they die? I think all these theories are pretty weird.
In 1959, 9 Russian students were found frozen to death in the Ural Mountains in an event now known as the Dyatlov Pass Incident. Found a mile from their tent without their winter clothes or boots, each one suffering inexplicable injuries. Despite the clues and evidence of violence, the official cause of death was stated as hypothermia. This only fueled conspiracy theories from alien visitors to Russian Yetis.
Go to forest.
Just what were the hikers fleeing from?
Произошел какой-то взрыв.
Maybe our government.
Every diary entry in every photo seems to hide a clue.
There were rumors that they just killed each other.
I don't believe that in any way could this be an accident.
With so many conflicting stories, I've come to Russia to ask the question, what is the true story of the Dyatlov Pass?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kulturecast. I am your host, Chris Stachiw, and I am joined by, someone who's never been on the show before. She is a physicist with mountain experience, as she put it, Dr. Kate Mullen.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
And she came at the suggestion of someone who has been on the show before, and this film was his idea. He posed it to me. So returning once again is my friend and yours, all the way from Texas Tech, where he's a professor of media and communications. He likes to be referred to as Hair Professor. I don't know why, for the life of me. He doesn't have a lick of hair on his head. Your friend and mine, Dr. David Perlmutter.
Thank you, Chris. Always good to be here. Appreciate it.
I guess I misunderstood what hair meant. That's German, not... yeah, I'm joking. I'm purely kidding. If you clicked on this episode and you have no idea what we're talking about, on this episode, we're going to be talking about a film from 2021 called An Unknown Compelling Force. It is a documentary about the Dyatlov Pass Incident, as it is known now, because one of the people who died in that incident is why it is named for that person. So we're going to be talking about the documentary. We'll be talking probably more about the incident itself, less the documentary, given that the documentary is just an opportunity to talk about the event, as it were. But we'll also talk about the film and kind of the way it does what it does. But before we talk about specifics, Kate, I think it's important for my audience to understand, what does mountain experience mean, and how does that translate into knowledge about this incident? And I guess more importantly, what is it that makes you so knowledgeable about the mountains and have mountain experience? What does that mean?
So I currently reside in California and spend a good deal of time in the Sierra Nevada here, but I've also climbed around the world in Chamonix and in other places that are glaciated or, have a significant snowpack. And what it means to have mountain experience in this case is that I'm familiar with the danger of avalanches, and I'm also familiar with some of the kind of, not full mountain slides, but like a wind slab letting loose when you dig a tent platform, which is unfortunately what the students did in the wrong place. So, I think that this podcast would be helped by some visuals, but I want everyone to think about a slope, maybe 30 degrees, and how would you set up a tent on that slope? Okay. Well, what you would want to do is cut a level platform for the tent.
Right.
And when you do so, you're going to have the upslope side of the mountain kind of exposed, a horizontal aspect of that mountainside exposed. And because you're, tired and the snow is heavy, you're not going to dig a huge platform. The tent is going to be almost against this horizontal, or I'm sorry, I'm saying horizontal, but I mean vertical, this vertical aspect of, where you dug out the side of the mountain. And I think that if you read some of the literature, peer-reviewed literature about what could have happened in this incident, there is a probable case to be made that there was a slab avalanche that filled in the tent platform hole and hurt the students. So I don't know if anybody listening doesn't know what happened, but 9 people were killed in a disaster in the mountains. And this disaster has been the subject of a lot of speculation and a lot of conspiracy theories. And my background, both as a mountaineer and as a physicist who's somewhat familiar with, friction and the forces that gravity brings to bear on snow, I look at this and I see something that can be explained with completely natural causes. And we can get into the exact hypothesis that I think has been credibly put forth about what happened. But I just bring to bear basically a lot of time in the mountains. Avalanches kill people every year. I live, in Los Angeles, but that's close to Mammoth Mountain, where a bunch of people have died this year on groomed ski trails. So, avalanches kill all the time. And I think it's a very likely hypothesis that an avalanche was involved, a slab avalanche filling in this tent platforms of a small, slide of snow.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today.
And what's crazy is, how uninteresting it would be for anyone to just accept that as the theory and move forward. Because, I mean, as David knows, as the person who had pitched the film, like, with this film, we don't start there. We don't start at that moment. And I think what's really exciting for this episode of the show and for what you just did is you more or less say right up at the front here what you perceive to be what happened. And for someone like myself who used to spend a lot of time on paranormal, supernatural, true crime, stuff like that, for a couple years I did a show about that. Like, this is that kind of case for a lot of people. It's like, this is aliens, Bigfoot, and it's like, you know what? That's fine and all, but why does it always have to be that? That's what I always ask, because, it's great that there's all these weird idiosyncrasies about the case, and there are all these weird things, and they're in the Ural Mountains where there were Russian Yetis, or it could be the indigenous people, but it's always way less exciting for it to just be something easily explained by a natural occurrence, because nature doesn't care.
And nature is so deadly. Yeah.
Right. As someone who spent a fair amount of time in Boy Scouts with over 100 nights of camping under my belt, I don't like camping in tents in snow because it's very, especially when it's just like what you're talking about, just snow. If it's
a small mistake can snowball, and I mean the margins for error are extremely low in the conditions the students were in, which is very, very cold temperatures. So I mean, you can let me know if you want to go through what I think is the most likely story. But so I think that they thought a slab avalanche was happening and that they didn't know the extent of the avalanche. And I think it just slid onto their platform that they had carved. It wasn't a mountain-wide avalanche.
Right.
But they were trained. These were members of the Explorers Club at their university. They were alpinists who had some knowledge of the dangers of avalanches, and their training would have told them, get to the side of it. The slide is going to continue. Once they did that in the night, it was very difficult for them to find their way back to the tent. And
the tents would have been gone, right?
Well, the tent was, I believe, partially buried when it was discovered. Right. But, this snow, wind-packed snow, can be 1,000 pounds per square meter. So when this slides onto the tent, even partially, it causes a panic. And even digging themselves out of the tent was, I believe, physically very hard. And, they probably had some degree of injuries just from that aspect of, the tragedy.
So I'm going to pose it to David first and then you, Kate. David, what did you think of the movie itself?
Yeah. So, Chris, we've talked before that we live in an era where you go on YouTube and especially sensational, popular mysteries, and I'll put that in what my children call sarcastic finger bunnies, air quotes, are covered and recovered over and over again. So if you go to YouTube and you enter Dyatlov Pass or Dead Mountain or one of the many monikers for this case, I think you're going to find thousands of videos. And I think there's at least 20 books in English, in Russian, or translated from Russian, maybe some other languages too. A lot has been talked about. I think I first heard about this case. I grew up in a certain Central European country that's famous for its mountains and its avalanches and its cheese. And I think I heard about this case when I was like 6 or 7. And the facts that at that time were that this was this amazing mystery, right? There was something super mysterious, that there was no explanation that covered all the observable fact. I think even at that young age, I was hearing that there was probably this was, I believe it or not, I was still alive during the Cold War. Yes, I know that's very old.
Hair doctor indeed.
Yeah. There was an assumption that anything that happened to the Soviet Union, there was something suspicious and something connected with the government covering up. By the way, that's really important. You mentioned true crime. You can have a cover-up without a mystery. Government, especially the Soviet government at that time, had this instinct to cover up anything that they felt might make the Soviet Union look bad. If you've ever watched the Chernobyl movie, there's lots to talk about there, the Chernobyl TV series, which was terrific. But so the Soviet Union probably did actually cover up aspects of this case, but that doesn't mean that there really isn't a mystery there or that the mystery has probably been solved. But it's one of those things that is box office, right? Like you put the Dyatlov Pass, and especially if you say solved, and a lot of the YouTube videos are solved. So one of the that attracted me to this movie was that I had heard from a friend who'd watched it that they thought that it did a pretty good job of not first going towards ridiculous sensationalism. So let me just give one example. First, you and I, Chris, and I know Kate too, appreciate good technical filmmaking. Like I have shown scenes from this film in a class where we talked about audio. Like they get good audio in the middle of the Urals in 50 mile per hour wind, where they have really clear audio, where somebody in a snowsuit, of a snow coat with their mouth covered is still talking very clearly. So like the technical part of this film, I would put A+ for documentary filmmaking. It is a beautiful film. They use drones. They use different effects with still pictures. So just watching this film, I personally enjoyed it, watching from beginning to end technically. I also appreciated that they took some of the more sensational theories, because they had to fill up 2 hours. They took some of the more sensational theories and did, I think, reasonably debunk them. And let me give two examples. One was that if you go online and you enter radiation and Dyatlov Pass, you're going to hear over and over again that one of the mysteries is that 1+ more of the hikers, that the investigators found that they had high radiation levels. I mean, you will find entire videos about like, oh, does this mean that a UFO abducted them, or like there was a secret Soviet nuclear test and they were caught? And the filmmakers did something which I thought was like good journalism, which is they found that one of the hikers, at least one, had worked at a Soviet nuclear plant for years. So that is a much more plausible explanation for why he might have high radiation levels, higher than the normal person, because he worked at a nuclear plant and before he went hiking. It wasn't anything to do with the hiking is there. So I like that part. And then the other part that I approved of journalistically was that one of the theories, which I won't put, I like to say non-zero. Everything is non-zero, right? Like magic pixies are non-zero. Alien UFOs are non-zero. Like it's possible, but it's just not probable or plausible. One of the theories was that there was foul play, right? That they were murdered and different individuals from Soviet soldiers to one of two native peoples were blamed. I like that the show went out of their way, although they did, I mean, you could argue back and forth. They did raise the theory, which is not very substantiated, of their possibility of foul play, but they really went out of their way to do something which a lot of first world documentary filmmakers don't do, which is to bring up the long history of blaming local native people for violence that occurred. And they'd say, like, let's not do that there. So you could say, well, they did bring it up, but then they did go ahead and say, like, unless you really have evidence, you shouldn't blame them. So I appreciated this film as in, like, if I were telling people, here's how you technically, like, sound, audio, cinematography, how to use a remote drone for photography. Boy, the planning that went into this, you as a filmmaker in terms of like production values, like I appreciated all that. And then I liked some of the things that were done in the movie, and we can talk about that later. So I liked it as filmmaking with some caveats, but it is so much better than the average YouTube, alien abduction Dyatlov Pass video that I had to give it some points because it's so much better than what you normally see about Dyatlov Pass.
What about you, Kate?
Well, I hate to be contrarian, and I respect Professor Perlmutter, of course, and I think he brings up some good points that, the film was beautiful. It's visually showing the Ural Mountains, which I'm not so familiar with, so as a virtual tourist, that was nice. But I would recommend anyone who is really interested in what happened in this incident to just forget the film. Okay, take that hour and 43 minutes out of your life and follow me to the following recommendation. Go to your library or look it up online or whatever. Maybe you might subscribe and find The New Yorker from May 2021. And read that piece. That piece, I think, is a really sober breakdown of not only the conspiracy theories that the YouTube documentary does consider in some detail, but the more naturalistic explanation that I find very convincing. And it gives credit to the Russian prosecutor. So this incident, as you guys have already mentioned, has been it's been the theme of swirling conspiracy theories ever since it happened in the 50s. So the families were never happy, and the Russian government finally opened up a new investigation in 2019. And I am not a proponent of the Russian government in any way, but they happen to have a prosecutor named Kuryakov, who I think did an admirable job at soberly analyzing this situation. And he discarded from the outset the conspiracy theories regarding aliens and missile tests and radioactivity. He just said, all of that isn't plausible. Let's talk about what really happened. And he, as the article discusses, has a naturalistic explanation that doesn't involve murder. It doesn't involve, anything that there's no evidence for. And he really ties up all of the facts of the case. And I'm happy to take you through that right now, or maybe we want to talk about something else. But I thought that, yes, Professor Perlmutter is correct. The film was visually striking, but I don't watch a lot of YouTube content. Maybe I'm just biased against, documentaries, and I prefer to read a scholarly analysis. But the New Yorker article wasn't overly boring or anything, and it really touched, I think, the actual points better. Whereas the YouTube documentary spends a ton of time on these experts who think that there was a murder or that there was some sort of other wild situation. And just in terms of the avalanche theory and the rest, he doesn't spend any time. And maybe that's partially bad timing, because I don't think that, that certain articles had already appeared, but he really gives short shrift, in my view, to the most likely explanation and spends like an hour and a half of the viewer's time on things that are sensational.
And so I kind of actually, I split the difference. Like I agree with you, Dr. Perlmutter, obviously. Like, it's a well-made film. I read a review that said, I wish to have seen what Werner Herzog could have done with the subject material, which 100%, like a Grizzly Man level kind of analysis, where it's less analyzing the event, but more analyzing how is the world so obsessed with something, or doing whatever Werner Herzog would have done, which would be taking a step to the side of it, and it being less about Dyatlov itself and more about some social aspect of it, because that's what Grizzly Man was about. Grizzly Man was really not about the man at the middle of it, but how did, whatever. If you've seen it, you know what I'm getting at. If you've seen Herzog, you know what his appeal is. His appeal is his kind of unique take on things. I would prefer that to this, because to your point, Dr. Mullen, I think it does fall a little flat for me, because at times I felt like, oh, well, we're not gonna even have an opinion on this at the end of it, which I had a real hard time walking away from this movie going, well, I'm not even gonna come down on what I think. Like, you've presented plenty of theories now. Why don't you pick one? I find that a little unfair, because as someone who sits here and has to have an opinion about things, that's part of your job as a filmmaker, at least as a documentarian in some respects, is to present what you think. And at the end of it to go, oh, I don't know either. I appreciate that. I respect that in some some capacity to say it's too deep and complex of a case for me to even understand or comprehend. But Dr. Mullen, I think you would agree, and Dr. Perlmutter to some extent, I don't think that this is that. Like, I don't think that this case is that. I think, to Dr. Perlmutter's point, there's a lot of fluff surrounding this that can be cut through very easily if you know where to look. I just think that getting caught in the fluff is very easy in any kind of thing, especially a true crime thing, and it's very easy to get bogged down in the, well, there was a radioactive shirt, or they took a picture on their phone or their camera and it looked like an alien. It's like, man, you can look at one piece of evidence over and over again, like the guy in Dealey Plaza with the umbrella. He was just a guy with an umbrella. That's it. They interviewed him, and he was just a guy with an umbrella. Errol Flynn interviewed him in a short documentary. He's just a dude with an umbrella. That's it.
Yeah, Chris, that's a really great example. In fact, I think you're referring to the New York Times did a short documentary on Umbrella Man. Like, and just, like, sometimes I do feel like we need to, not everybody is like an expert on this case or like knows about the John F. Kennedy assassination, but like one of the, and again, I put my sarcastic finger buddies, my air quotes, mysteries of that has been talked about in 6,000 YouTube videos and 500 books of John F. Kennedy is there was a man at Dealey Plaza there as the motorcade went by who opened an umbrella, right? And so if you go on YouTube today or really any other social media, you'll see a lot of people saying like, well, why did he do that? It must have been a signal or something like that. The New York Times actually did a little mini documentary. And what was funny was that the moment they interviewed him, I suddenly understood a cultural reference, which I'm old enough to remember in that it was one generation before me. But then I realized that nobody who was growing up later than that would have understood that cultural reference. He was making a cultural reference to Neville Chamberlain and Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Nazi Germany. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, who famously, I like to think of myself as a historian, so there's like a whole other 3-hour discussion, but Neville Chamberlain was the prime minister who allowed Hitler to take over Czechoslovakia and was the architect of what has become to known through history as appeasement. There's a lot of discussion there. I'm not saying an opinion, but he famously always carried around or was visible with an umbrella. So this man was making a statement that he thought John F. Kennedy was appeasing the Soviet Union. But that explanation is so pedantic, or just so buried within like historical references that it got so it was funny how it's become something else. But when you look it up, it has a perfectly rational explanation. But that's an important point about whenever we see an image, and we have examples every day. I just spent a seminar where there was an image. There is a massacre, horrible human tragedy going on in the Sudan right now, where like hundreds of thousands of people are being killed. Well, there was a picture that was posted like 3 months ago that purportedly was from Google Earth showing lots of dead bodies. And it was everywhere. You can find 500,000 iterations. Google Earth shows massacre victims. It wasn't. I mean, Yale Laboratories did a study. New York Times did a study. It was actually cows lined up at a solar-powered watering station that was, and so here's the problem. When people make a claim that like, oh, this is evidence of genocide, and the evidence turns out to be, no, it's not evidence at all, people begin to doubt the very facticity of pictures. And that's why, when I'm teaching, I'm telling students, be careful to get the facts right? So like, if you think somebody's opening an umbrella to signal assassins, how about you go find the person and interview them before you make that claim? So that's a great example, Chris.
That umbrella opening, man, made it all the way to the X-Files. I mean, that was in the episode. I mean, like and it's to that point where, I mean, like with the explanation, and again, Dr. Mullen, I watched the documentary like you did. I also read several years back the Donnie Eicher book, which I don't know, again, good, bad. I want to say it walks away with the wind being the explanation, that they had some sort of wind event that was happening that caused it to be
I don't mean to interrupt. Yeah, I've read a little bit about that, and Professor Perlmutter was raising it to me because I was saying, look, let's just listen to peer-reviewed scientists who say that this slab, avalanche is completely plausible, and they've done a careful study. And Professor Perlmutter said, well, there's also this paper about Kalman vortex effects. And so a Kalman vortex effect is a turbulent flow, that I guess a couple of scientists hypothesized, I haven't read the paper, I must admit, hypothesized could have emerged from wind flow around the mountains and agitated the inner ear of the 9 victims and driven them crazy. And that could have been the instigation for them to flee the tent site and, then subsequently freeze to death. So I have to say, I will draw on my mountain experience. I'm not saying it's bullshit. I'm not saying it's completely bullshit. I'm saying it's 99.999% bullshit.
It sounds like bullshit.
Well, I don't know. I mean, look, every single year in every single mountain, area, people die of hypothermia, they die of avalanche. I've never heard of anyone driven crazy by a vortex in the wind. I just don't.
That's the problem, is like you just alluded to there. It's not like these 9 people were in a room talking to one another and then all of a sudden the room combusted. And where did the fire come from? They were in the mountains in the middle of winter, where, like you've already alluded to, things can go very wrong very quickly at a moment's notice based on something that you did not take into account. And sometimes, I'm sure you will tell me, could not have even taken into account. All the planning in the world can't take everything into account when you're out in nature. And I haven't been in as high a stakes as nature as I'm sure you have, but I've been in high stakes nature enough to know that when you hear a bear jumping at the bear bag out hung up on the tree 15 feet from your tent, you don't move, and you just stay calm. That's
you're in a situation where a small, a small deviation from safety can really snowball, and I believe that that's what happened once their tent was buried.
So I want
a really important point. I guess I've watched too many of these lost hiker videos, and there's some really good people like they're mountain guides, and they do videos about cases in the United States. I think part of the argument I'm making is that, and this is because I spend every semester with 200 to 400 18-year-olds, so I sort of find out what's current in popular culture, what they've been watching, as opposed to maybe scientists, who've gone through peer review or people. First, I learn a lot from my students because they're discovering things that I just haven't heard of before because they're on social media much more than I am and scoring corners out. But I also sort of hear what they have come to believe because of what the evidence they've been shown. And typically, when I was growing up, my parents watched the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, and they were they were both university professors. They subscribed to 5 newspapers and 4 magazines. So for 1985, we were pretty well informed about current events and things like that. But of course, today, none of my students are watching the evening news, even if I could completely trust the national evening news, which I, as a journalism professor, have some questions about that. But they're getting their sources of information from TikTok videos, from Instagram, from 5-minute shorts on YouTube. And so I'm willing to give a lot more points to somebody who is better than the average in sort of educating people on how to ask questions correctly and look things up. And so that's why I guess I'm more fond of this documentary, because it's better than the average. And I think it's a model for what a direction you could go, as opposed to the average, the scientific category you used, Dr. Mullen, twice to categorize videos of that were just full of errors. So I just documentary is very difficult because fiction films you can say based on a true story, but Chris, based on a true story you can make everything up. Still,
well, we gotta have some drama in there for dramatic effect. I mean, life has to be. There's got to be some drama to it, and that's the thing. I mean, I think we would all agree. Look, this makes a good story, regardless of the explanation. You have 9 hikers; they all go out together and they all die, and it's all very sad. I guess for me, I don't understand why that's not enough. Why is that not enough? Like 9 people lost their lives in a hiking accident. Why does it have to be aliens? Why does it have to be Bigfoot? Why any of that? Because again, like, and I feel part of it is also a societal kind of expectation and a societal way of thinking that, like, by deflecting to a conspiracy theory, it doesn't really force us to look at it as just like 7 people went out, or 9 people went out there and died because they weren't necessarily doing everything that they should have been doing in terms of keeping track of the elements and things. And like, that's harder to accept than there was a nuclear test and they were irradiated and they were killed by the Soviets. Like, I mean, it's a fun story, makes for a good script, but that's all it is. It makes for a fun story. But in reality, you know, it's not anything other than just, like you said, Dr. Mullen, there's a reasonable explanation, and people die from avalanches in the mountains all the time. Why is that not enough? Why is that even not enough?
I mean, I think it's a very sad answer, and that's that the government in the Soviet Union was lying to its citizens for so long. And I mean, I also think that maybe it's important to acknowledge that, 20 years before this accident happened, Stalin and his goons were shoveling Jews, intellectuals, and anyone who they perceived to be an enemy of the state into the Gulag. Okay, so 18 million people were imprisoned in Russia. The Russian people were not trusting their government. Even after Stalin's death, but which was a few years before this accident happened, there was still a system of secret police. People were informing on each other. Everyone trusted no one. Okay, for very good reason. And so the sad background to these wild stories is that the Russian people were, willing to believe anything and everything because they were in this atmosphere of untruth. Like Hannah Arendt once said, the German philosopher, you bring a people to believe that there is no truth, that truth and false are just non-categories because nobody knows anything. Evidence is always manipulatable. Somebody's always trying to lie to you. And I mean, that's a terrible background. If anyone is interested, I also read a 2020 Atlantic article. So The Atlantic is a magazine that I thought was very interesting. It was by a Russian, or a journalist in Russia at the time, who just said, you know what, a majority of people in Russia don't believe that the Apollo moon landing happened. Okay, this is a citizens tree that is completely over truth. They have no bearing in the world. They'll believe any fantastic story because really truth has been undermined by their own government for so long.
What's funny is I used to say that we as Americans are living in a post-truth society. And I think we are only now living in it in the last like 5 to 10 years, maybe 15, 20, and depending on how far back you want to go, because I only have frame of reference for my own life. But then I again, like Dr. Perlmutter said, I am a student of history as well. Like the Russian people have been living in the world that they've been living in for so long. They're like post-truth. They're in a world that I think few societies would ever want to be in, which is like you said, Dr. Mullen, where it's like, what do we believe at this point? Well, whatever we want is a bad way of putting it, but it's almost like whatever you can stomach or whatever seems within your scope and scheme of worldview that doesn't upset your worldview too much. I mean, again, there were people in Russia. I've talked about my family history on this podcast before. My dad's dad came over from Ukraine. He rode on the back of Nazi tanks to escape the Russians. So,
oh my God, what a family history for you to be doing this podcast.
Yeah, I know. Dr. Perlmutter's just like, hey, let's talk about Russia, everybody. I'm just kidding. It doesn't bother me one bit, but I think people fail to forget. And now it's been like, obviously, I think in the last like 5 years or 4 years, 3 years now, more people are aware of the Russian treatment of people in Europe and the surrounding country, and Ukraine being one of them. And I think people in this country really fail to understand how bad people in Russia truly have it. Because there are people in Russia that truly believe that the invasion of Ukraine was acceptable, believable, and understandable because there were Nazis in Ukraine, apparently, according to the
Jewish
Russians.
President. Yes.
Right. Makes sense to me anyways. But I think our people in our country for a long time were desensitized to Russia. and what Russia means as a country and what the Russian government as a body of people has done to its own people. But yeah, they are living in post-truth at this point. Because, I mean, yeah, if you're willing to believe Bigfoot killed 9 hikers, I mean, yeah, I guess you're willing to believe damn near anything.
Yeah, and part of it is the phenomenon that, like, I mean, psychology has observed this for 100 years, is that human beings form beliefs and then new data is incorporated to support those beliefs. So, like, we like to say seeing is believing, but actually what I argue to my students is that for most people, believing is seeing. That is, if you present them with anything, they will reinterpret it to fit into, especially if they have a very hard-held belief, like it might be a belief that they've grown up with. And so prejudices are that way, that if you hate people from some kind of religion or some kind of country, no matter what evidence you get about those people, you will reinterpret it into your hatred. It's very, very hard to move people from a position of hardcore belief in whatever it is, no matter how ridiculous it might appear to others. And then you're also, and it's really interesting to me getting you two together, because you do have very different backgrounds in your professions, but you're agreeing. I think all three of us agree on a very important point, which is that I mean, I would say maybe 20 years ago, I used to study conspiracy theories in the media, and I was a little bit of a scofftic, as the pejorative goes, in the sense that I would just go like, how could anybody believe that? But then after 20 years of seeing the general incompetence of institutions, government, corporations, in dealing with complex information and explaining it, I sort of understand now why people don't trust necessarily big anything, big farming, big pharma, whatever. I mean, I was on a true crime podcast recently. We were talking about the MIT Brown shooting case, where a number of officials came out real early and said there's no connection between the two cases. Now, as somebody who wrote a book on police and the media, and somebody who teaches at a college where we teach crisis communication, I would highly advise people in authority never to say there is no connection between two things unless you've 100% proved to exhaustion. Don't say it one day into the incident, especially, because what happens then is a lot of people online go, aha, you see, the police are lying to us, the government is lying to us, because, and by the way, in those cases, I don't think they were intentionally lying. They were just, and all authorities try to do this. They want to reassure the public, but in the methods they use to reassure the public, they create more confusion and less trust in the public. So the Soviet Union, as both of you have pointed out, this was true exponentially. And so, yeah, you raised several generations of people through the present day. I mean, Russia had a free press for about 3 months in 1917. They had a press that was unfettered. I mean, it was party located, in the sense that, it would probably speak for certain interests. But you could go in St. Petersburg for about 3 months in 1917, you could go by newspapers that disagreed with each other. That's the only time in the history of Russia that you could get different points of view. Right now, Russia just closed access to the Telegram channel, which is very interesting because that used to be, and still is, a lot of pro-Putin, pro-Russian government channels were there, but they still closed access to it. That's how restrictive they've gotten about people getting information. So it's just, this case, this documentary, this case is just a good example of, I can understand why people go to crazy explanations, because they've been lied to so often that maybe they just don't trust the system, the scientific system, the government system, the press system anymore, even though I do trust parts of those.
Mm-hmm. And I think when you introduce those kind of fantastical, I think, theories into it, because again, I'm not one to not believe in those things. I believe in Bigfoot and ghosts and aliens. I believe in them with the best of them. I really do, genuinely, hand to God, I do, or Yahweh, whoever you believe. I believe in all that stuff. It's just, you can't apply it. And this is the thing that always bugs me. You can't apply it to every single thing, every single time. Anytime there's a weird thing that happens to people in the woods, it just sounds like a bunch of people who have never been out into the woods saying, well, they're out in the woods and weird things happen. have you been out in the woods? Weird things happen all the time. Like, go sit in a tent out in the dark at night. Any noise that's made outside of your tent, you can ascribe to anything. And I don't know why it needs to be any scarier than that. If you're walking down a trail and your flashlight goes out and there's no lights around you and you're nowhere near your camp, why does there need to be anything scarier than that? And then all of a sudden we introduce Bigfoot, all sorts of, again, it gets to a point where it's like we've already alluded to, like, where do we stop here? Because at some point we just have to say, look, it was this or this or this, and that's what it is. We need to take a rational explanation and go with that, not ignore what the people who are trying to do their due diligence were doing. Now, to Dr. Perlmutter's point, and your point, Dr. Mullen, they weren't doing that then. So that's hard to really accept because the Russian government wasn't doing it. If they had been, maybe this would be different and people wouldn't be talking about it in 2026, but I feel like that we'd still be having this conversation now. Because I think 9 people dying in the middle of the Ural Mountains in the time that they died is always going to make for a good story, just like Tunguska always makes for a good story. Like that's the other thing I think of when I think of Dyatlov, is I think of Tunguska, which also seemingly may have a rather innocuous explanation as well.
I would also say that, people are pushed out of windows in Russia every day, practically. And I mean, it's not convenient for the government for people to focus on that. And so there's an aspect of this that is kind of like, it's a harmless thing to focus on because the government won't, be threatened by us asking questions. And I don't know if it's timely, but I could just run through what I think is the most naturalistic explanation.
Yeah, please. I am so very curious because I came into this believing it was aliens. I'm just kidding. I am just kidding. I'm so disappointed in the documentary. Someone did not say the aliens dropped them from high up, and that's why it looks like they were hurt as much as they were. I was hoping
we're going in that direction with that light theory. Okay.
I was waiting for it. I was like, they're going to say they were dropped from alien spaceships. Here we go. Like, I'm waiting for it.
Yeah. So anyway, these 9 people were taking this massive cross-country ski voyage, and they were on the side of a mountain after several days out and cut, as I said before, a platform for their tent. And they cut it on a slope that, was somewhere in the vicinity of 30 degrees, which snow scientists have published peer-reviewed papers studying whether or not this could happen on the given terrain where the tent platform was, and they've concluded that it could. So basically they dug a platform, they put their tent there, and 9 hours later, after, the snow had settled, it let rip. Okay. So basically that little pocket where they had dug out partially buried them. And they were forced, and so they had stripped down for the night. They had no more parkas, and they had their boots off. They were asleep. And so all of a sudden...
Kate, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a really important point you just made there, which people who are not familiar with the case, is that the temperature was like 50, 35, 50, 60, we don't know exactly, but just unbelievable cold, like un-American cold.
Yes. These were tough students. They were tough as nails.
They were in a tent, and the tent was heated. That's right? Like there was a stove.
I am not sure if they had
in the tent.
Stove.
I wasn't clear on how because you said they stripped down.
Yeah.
Like most people would imagine, like, oh gosh, if it's minus 50 outside, how are they keeping warm? And did that have anything? Because this comes. The reason I interrupt you is because this comes up a lot about injuries in the tent before they got out. Sorry to interrupt, but just...
I'm not sure about the technicalities of their winter kit, like whether or not they had sleeping bags or exactly how they were outfitted. But I mean, people in the same period of time were making Himalayan expeditions. So it's not like they couldn't stay warm without a stove. I don't know if there was a stove in the tent, but 9 people packed together, under reasonable blankets and with some thermal underwear isn't, necessarily requiring a stove, even in deep winter. But in any case, I believe that a slab let loose onto their tent, and this caused them great panic. They believed, I think, that the entire slope was going to let loose at any moment. And so this caused them to flee without digging out their boots and their other winter gear. So they fled like 150 feet or something to the side of their tent in pitch black darkness. And, after they made that move, it was very hard for them to find the tent again. And what they ended up doing is all 9 of them went together about a little less than a mile away to the forest, to the edge of the forest where there was a cedar tree. Then they climbed the cedar tree and got down branches. This is known because the branches were broken, but there were also bits of human skin on the tree. So they basically had none of their winter gear, no boots. I mean, they were basically dead at that point, but they valiantly tried to, save themselves. They built a fire, and 2 of them died right then and there. So the ones who were, probably less well dressed died. The others took their clothes off, cut the clothes off the body or whatever, just put the dead people's clothes on in a desperate attempt to save themselves. Now, there were only 7 left, and 3 of the 7 made a desperate attempt to find the tent again in order to they realized that they were going to die without their warm gear. So those 3 were eventually found frozen to death, facing uphill. The other 4 decided, okay, guys, we're going to get through this by building a snow cave. I mean, which is, normally that's how huskies spend the night. They dig a little hollow in the snow. And I mean, a snow cave would, under normal circumstances, possibly have saved them, but it was simply too cold. So they basically went into a ravine where the snow was deeper, and they started to excavate. Unfortunately, in the bottom of the ravine was a running stream, and at some point, with an icy shell over the running water. At some point, their digging disturbed that icy shell. They broke through. They had catastrophic injuries as, they fell into this stream bed. And eventually, this entire area became completely covered in snow. So that when 4 months or something later, they were found, I think actually they weren't found until the spring, until the snow melted. But when that happened, their bodies were in terrible condition and largely decomposed. So anyway, I think that explanation has basically no outlandish bits to it. Unfortunately, they after they left their tent, they were sitting ducks in this cold weather. And I think that the tragedy is that, that these 9 lost their lives and that there's been such speculation around it since. But I do find that this explanation really ties up all of the evidence that's known to the, as far as I am aware.
So I want to ask you then, because your telling is it's very sad, obviously. There's nothing about it that's remotely fun. If you've been like you have clearly, and Dr. Perlmutter, I don't want to assume if you've gone out and camped at all, but I would assume at some point in your life you may have gone out and camped. Like, having gone out and been places where you're far enough away where if something goes wrong, you're in deep trouble. They were like to the furthest extent beyond that. Like, they were beyond that in a way that, like, if something bad happened, this is exactly what would happen. In your mind, as someone who has been out in mountains, not these mountains, not the Urals, but other mountains, what would have saved them in that moment? Or was there, obviously, or was there anything they could have done? Did they doom themselves by cutting that tent platform out? And was that already, too late by that point?
I mean, obviously, in retrospect, they could have camped in the forest instead of on the exposed slope where this was likely to happen. But I think that in retrospect, the New Yorker article pointed out, and I agree, that their experience in the mountains might have doomed them because they had been trained in avalanche safety. And when this slab avalanche buried their tent platform, they immediately evacuated, whereas less experienced mountaineers would have just stayed there and dug out their winter kit. And, it was buried under a lot of snow that wouldn't have been easy by any means, and they could have still all died. So I'm not going to say that I know that it would make a difference,
right,
or that they could have saved themselves given the really harsh winter conditions. But I think, given everything, to separate themselves from their warm clothes and boots was a death sentence.
You've raised a really interesting point. I want to circle back, I guess, cinematically. And this is a hypothesis that I'd like you both to address about a sort of wider issue. Again, you go on YouTube and you see videos, some really well done, about like a missing hiker was found dead and like 3 yards from the trail, and I don't have the experience of either of you. I skied in Switzerland when I was in my single digits, and that was pretty scary back then. They didn't have any bunny slopes. Every slope was a blackhead slope or something like that. But with ski gear of the time. But human beings like to imagine that we're in control, right? And we also, most of us, especially in the first world, even in so-called wilderness, and I think ecologists argue about whether there's anything on planet Earth that is still true wilderness, that everything has been shaped by humans' presence, either indirectly or directly. It's like North America, we see trees which are all post-colonial trees and so on. So is there an issue here that the expertise of these hikers added to the mystery? Because we keep thinking like, oh, they were so experienced. I understand they were going for their certification. Like there was a top level of certified like wilderness hiker, a mountain climber in the Soviet Union that you'd get there. Some of them much less experienced than others, but there were definitely people who had been in those situations before. And there's an essential resistance we have as humans to think that nature can overpower our technology, our preparedness, and our expertise. And so we tend to impose mysteries on things that maybe, the margin, as you said, Dr. Mullen, the margin of error was really low when it's 50 degrees in pitch dark, right? Yeah. And I have been, and I'm sure a lot of people, like I was hiking in Colorado and I went off the trail. This is a trail where I swear there was like 50 people behind me and 50 people in front of me. I went off the trail because I saw a bird and I immediately stopped and looked back and realized I could not see the trail. But because I'd seen all these YouTube videos of people who'd gotten lost like 1 minute from the trail, I immediately recognized the rock and I got back on the trail. But if I'd followed that bird, in this park where there were thousands of people, I would have been lost. Now, I would have found my way back. But I think, isn't there a resistance to the idea that human technology and human expertise can be defeated by this thing called nature?
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely right. And I really think that anyone who goes into the mountains needs to assume the risk and that there are certain unmitigatable risks. And what you raised made me think about how when there's a mountain accident, like, unfortunately, a friend I knew when I was in high school just died in Colorado this past year. And he was a very experienced climber on steep terrain and was going to pick up a water bottle that's not a water bottle, but like a discarded piece of litter, like a can or something that somebody had littered on the trail. And he did that and lost his footing and unfortunately fell, cracked his skull open and died. And I think in that example, there's a lot of people who look at what happened and try to say, well, that couldn't have been me. I would have not made such a silly mistake. And to always think that things are somewhat under our control if only we do X and Y right. Whereas the truth is that probabilities add up. And at any given moment when you're in an unforgiving terrain, things could happen that are basically out of your control, and that when you put yourself in those environments, in these beautiful natural places, there is some unmitigatable risk that you just must accept, that it won't be your fault if something happens, but the rocks underneath your feet could give way, or lots of unforeseeable things could happen. And when we're backseat, or when we're looking in the rear view mirror of an accident, I would urge people to really don't always blame the victim. Sometimes you're just in an unforgiving atmosphere, and somebody acting reasonably could simply die for chance. Or
I was going to say, first off, obviously that's horrible about your friend. Sorry to hear that. That's awful. And you said it yourself, like the idea that it's like, well, I would never make that mistake. Well, with hindsight, it's always easy to say that. And also, like you said, like I have, as I'm sure plenty of people have, gone to do something and something else happens that you could not have anticipated. And it's like, you know what, even in those minor instances, and like you said, even in this instance where the environment is already statistically working against you, because it feels like you're rolling a dice that's maybe not loaded per se, but only half of the time, there's only half of the faces are going to come up on that dice. And you're hoping it's not one of the three, because it can't be any of the other ones. It just can't. In this scenario, half of the fucking dice is just blurred out because you on a mountainside On a normal time, it's a problem, let alone with snow, the negative degrees, the isolated nature of where they were. It's like, how much more risk does one need to take to prove control over oneself, control over nature? They were probably not even concerned with any of that. They were just there to go do what they did best, which was go hike, and things happen. Like you said, people go climb Everest all the time successfully. People die on Everest all the time too. All the time. And we're living in 2026 and people still die on Everest. You know why? Because it's Mount Everest and it's nature, and it's the most short of going underwater in a carbon fiber tube to the Titanic. There's nothing you can do above ground that's as dangerous.
Yeah, the inherent risk of the activity is simply like I believe that one should accept it or not go into these places. And by the way, there's inherent risk of sitting on your couch and never doing anything either. We're all not getting out of this alive, right?
Right. Well, and that's the other thing. I always tell my mom this, my mom who's criminally afraid of a lot of things. Like, you get in your car every day, you turn it on and you drive around. That is unfathomable to many people outside of this country, let alone plenty of people in this country who do not drive. But getting behind the wheel of an automobile is much more dangerous than sitting and watching a movie on TV that may cause a level of fear within you. But I mean, my parents go and do all kinds of genuinely dangerous things, like traveling and doing dangerous things. And it always surprises me that my mother is willing to go and pet whales in Baja California, but can't watch a horror movie. There's that disconnect with people because, again, I mean, people think that they can just go out into the woods and they'll be fine. And like you said, David, you can go into a relatively crowded place and disappear. You can disappear in Yellowstone. That is a national park in the contiguous United States. You know, the Dyatlov Pass is scary in a way, but the thing that always scares me more, and Dr. Mullen, I don't know if you have heard of this, Missing 411, a series of books all about hikers and people that have just gone missing in our national parks. That's much scarier than the Dyatlov, because like these people are literally just disappearing. And to Dr. Perlmutter's point, it's probably some level of accidental complicity in one's own disappearance. But some of it is also someone was in front of me on a trail, walked around a bend, and they were gone. So that's much scarier than, you know, people in the Dyatlov Pass. It's very sad what happened to people in Dyatlov. That's for me the takeaway. Like you with the story you were telling, your explanation, like that's just sad. A bunch of people freezing to death in the woods is just sad. Really, really sad. Because it's not like the Donner Party where it's like, well, they made a choice to do the unthinkable. Like, nope, these people just knew because, like you have said, Dr. Perlmutter, they knew they were going to die. That's actually way worse. Like, if it was someone who doesn't understand the ramifications of that temperature and how quickly you'll die out there, they're just essentially ignorant to their own death. These people knew that they were going to die within a couple hours out in that cold. That's why they tried to build a fire. That's why they tried to build a snow den. Like, these things are just overwhelmingly sad and depressing, which I think is more society unwilling to confront the sad, horrifying truth of you go out into the woods with your friends sometimes, and sometimes nobody comes back. Like, it's not going to happen very often, but it does happen.
I do have...
sorry. I just want to say, going back to the film for a moment, that I do give the film points for actually expressing what you both have said. Like, there's a scene in the film where the filmmakers are out because they went to the location, right? They tried to go to the exact spot where this occurred. And it was in relatively good weather conditions. It was sunny and things like that. And I think at some point the filmmaker says, "Oh my God, it's so cold. It's so miserable here." And like, I have no interest in going and investigating the location myself. You, Chris and Kate, you go there and, you know, report back what you find. I'll watch from my living room. But it gave an impression of how brave these people were, because they were going there to prove themselves. We go back to Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, the Sherpa, were the two men who conquered Everest. Again, there's a theory that there were two Englishmen who disappeared going up Everest. One of their bodies has been found, and there's a non-zero chance they may have made it to the top. But the people who made it to the top and got back out again, Sir Edmund Hillary, he actually said mountain climbing consisted of getting to the top of the mountain and then down again safely. That was a very famous quote about mountain climbing, which I approve of, right? You know, if you go to the mountain and die at the top of the mountain, it's not a successful climb, you know, there. But these people were doing something within their margin of safety. They weren't doing something ridiculously foolish. They weren't taking some wild risk that people had warned them against. This was within they just had this low margin of error. And it goes back to, I mean, it's almost like a joke. They died doing what they loved, and they died horribly, and they were young people. I mean, I think the oldest one was at early 40s or something. And it's a tragedy, but, human beings have advanced, like to the moon, because we really have gone to the moon. I think the three of us may agree on that, like humans.
Regardless of what the Russian government says, or the Russian people, what they may believe.
Yeah. Well, that's what's funny is that one of the many arguments against the moon hoax theory, the idea that the United States made it up, was that we were in this Cold War. And like, if the Russians could have found any evidence that the Americans had not gone to the moon, they would have run with it.
Oh,
and made it. And yeah, instead they congratulate us and said, good job. We wish we made it there first. So it sort of works both ways. But the key being that, there's a control instinct. We like to think we're in control. There's a blame instinct.
Yeah.
It makes us feel better if we think somebody died doing something that maybe we couldn't do, or something we could do, and say, oh, it was their fault. But sometimes it's just circumstance, right? Like, you were standing on the beach and a wave came.
Yeah.
And you were the one person in the history of the world who's been taken away by a wave at that one point, right? Or our ancestors, one of our somebody whose genetics did not survive was just walking along when a saber-toothed tiger happened to be there, and so their genes were not passed on. It wasn't survival of the fittest; it was survival of the luckiest. So I think that's a takeaway lesson from the film, was that, oh my God, how miserable and tough the conditions were out there, and these people were heroic in conquering that. They just had according to the science, one really, really bad stroke of luck.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd very much agree with that. And I wanted to mention, just following up on Chris, what you were saying about this 411 series. I've never heard of that one, but the American Mountaineering Association puts out a series every year called Accidents in North American Mountaineering, and it sounds very similar. It just is like a case report of all of these things that happen, and then they do an accident analysis. Sometimes it's just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or you're doing everything right, but
the 411 series is Bigfoot. I'm not making that.
But the problem is, the problem with the missing 411 series is, and Dr. Mullen, you've already alluded to this with Dyatlov, like, when there is no explanation that will suffice, minds start to wander. And with some people, there will be no explanation that will suffice. And with missing 411, there are some things in those cases where, like Dr. Perlmutter said, sometimes they say aliens or Bigfoot. And again, hypothesizing is just hypothesizing. But, again, when you have, with some of these missing 411s, they have less. The Dyatlov, they have so much with this. It's, in my mind, it's like, if there's plenty of people willing to do scientific analysis, which there have been plenty of studies, both contemporary and ones at the time that people were doing, and there's been answers that people like yourself, learned people that are scientists, can agree on, that people within the mountain exploring or kind of like the people that are in that world can agree on. I don't see why the conversation needs to continue unless people, like Dr. Perlmutter put it, want to just keep making documentaries, sensationalizing it. There are plenty of other things out there that have less evidence behind them that people could throw themselves at, that maybe could get some groundswell behind, that, similar to the Dyatlov Pass thing, could get scientists or people in academia to get involved with. Because, to be fair, the reason a lot of these things haven't had any sort of real, I would say, conclusive evidence behind them is, and you guys both know this as people in academia have reputations to uphold, and they don't want to be seen as people that are associated with Bigfoot research in a serious capacity, alien research in a serious capacity. And I think that's unfair, but I think it's also completely understood, because as someone who's in academia and has a reputation to uphold, you don't want it soured by things that some people think are unsavory or, fantastical in some of these cases. And Dyatlov is one of those things where I know that's not why you're not wanting to talk about it, Dr. Mullen, but because I know that there's a genuine, real explanation that I agree with you with. Like, I think it was just an avalanche. I think the fantasticalization or the kind of the hype, like turning everything that's happened into hyperbole is much more interesting than not that what happened, but than talking about how is it Bigfoot or how is it aliens? Because it's not. It's just not any of those things.
Yes, yeah. Just to clarify, so David Paulides, I think is his name, has built quite an empire from Missing 411. I think there's dozens of books.
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
I don't know how many documentaries. The one documentary I saw was called Missing 411: The Hunted. And as to what you both were saying, they had some really, I would use the word interesting in its actual meaning, oh, that's interesting. Like people who went missing where there was, at least in the described circumstances, there's a great podcast out there, Skeptoid. Brian Dunning is the host of that. And he often points out, when we hear in the sensational descriptions, the descriptions aren't correct. If you go back and look at the original sources, some of the things which are so-called mysterious never happened. They were just made up by journalists at the time or somebody at the time. But in the Missing 411 documentary, which I recommend watching for fun, there are some cases which are, that's interesting. But then in the middle of them, he has a group of people who describe how they go into a secret spot to listen to Bigfoot, Big Feet, Bigfoot's plural, talk to them. I mean, can you imagine, there's a documentary about normal missing things, and then just in the middle of it is a reference to Bigfoot.
He's not being facetious, Dr. Mullen. It is that stark of a contrast. It's people missing, and here's this recording of Bigfoots that we have in the woods. I think is this Dr. Perlmutter, is this the one with the predators in the trees as well? Is this the one with the invisible predator in the trees? Is that this documentary?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the if you don't, this is
Dr. Mullen's I have to leave now. My professional credibility isn't. There's
that you can have crazy stuff that woo, as the famous Amazing Randy called it, woo, sensational, probably 1,000,000 to 1 unlikely stuff happening adjacent to reasonable stuff. And it's incumbent upon people who do documentaries, because I believe in the documentary format, whether you're doing a 5-minute video on YouTube or this, which was a high grade, Hollywood cinematic, top of the line professional documentary, to distinguish between the two and not confuse them. And I think that's one of the takeaways, I think, from whether it's for my students who want to create their own videos and tell stories, or for us as professional, journalists or scientists, is that we have to be careful about mixing our sources where they don't belong mixed there. So
yeah,
that's one of my takeaways.
Well, and for me, it's again, the Dyatlov Pass incident and all of the kind of groundswell and kind of discussion around it. It should be focused on the 9 people who passed away, and honestly, doing more to inform people about how to be better campers and hikers, and how to set up a tent better, honestly, and be more mindful of your surroundings when you're out in the woods. Just going out into the woods unprepared is a genuinely bad idea. I had mentioned that I was in Boy Scouts. I am an Eagle Scout. I had been out of Boy Scouts for 15 years the last time I went camping, and I was woefully underprepared then, and I will not be the next time I go. And that was 3 years ago. I mean, it's one of those things where if you're not in a mindset and a headspace to relinquish all of your belongings and surroundings and go out into nature and be in nature for a while, it's not for the faint of heart. And I think as we kind of bring this episode to a close, I think the thing that's probably the most important is, as we are in the times we're in now, where we're able to sit, the 3 of us, none of us in the same state, having a conversation about something that happened in the 60s. As interconnected as we are now, to go out into nature is such a stark contrast from the world we live in now. And it didn't used to be. People used to go to bed at 8 o'clock because there was no electricity and the sun was down. And that's it. We're not staying up doing anything. It's time for bed. And you wake up when the sun comes up. That's the way things used to be before electricity. So, us people in the last 150 years or, 120 years taking advantage of electricity and public, transit and toilets and all kinds of things don't appreciate what it would have to be like to walk outside of your house to go to the bathroom at night, which people didn't like to do. And that's what people used to have to do before indoor plumbing. So to go out into nature and remove yourself from everything is not for the faint of heart. And like Dr. Perlmutter said, the fact that the documentarian could not get to where they were himself is telling. It should be telling for anyone watching the documentary that, and Dr. Mullen, I'm sure you can speak more to this about having gone into the mountains, because I've not gone into the mountains to camp. I was, the most I ever did was going to Philmont for Boy Scouts, which is mountainous, but it's not what you're talking about. The margin of error is low when you're out in nature as it is, but when you go to places like that, it's so much lower than you can even comprehend, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm. And he hauled himself in there using snowmobiles. So These students were under their own power. And you're absolutely right. Like today, we have satellite communication, SOS devices, and a range of other things that can help. But they were out on a wild limb. They were very brave. They were the best of Russia. They were really vanguards of adventure. And I respect them for that. And I wish that they had, lived to tell the tale.
Yeah, me too, because again, I think they would be very sad to know that they kind of died rather ignominiously. I mean, freezing to death in the Russian mountains is a pretty awful way to go. And then having your body found, 6 months later in the springtime, that's awful. I mean, but you hear about, to go back to the 2026 of it all, you hear about people climbing Everest. And after a certain point on Everest, if you die, you're not coming back down. Your body's left on Everest, and that's right. Mm-hmm. Like, that's it. Like, they leave you. And what do you do? I mean, like, that still happens now. I'm sure it happens with a lot less regularity than it used to, but it still happens. So you can't mitigate away all the risk just because you think you can. And that's the thing. Like, this documentary, I think, is very, should be very sobering for anyone wanting to go out and do anything like this. Because even if you're well prepared, you still might not be able to do
And I will
everything.
say, I mean, I have a lot of Eastern European friends just because I was a science student in the US where a lot of foreign students study. And my friends from the Eastern Bloc, they do sing the praises of the Soviet government in one sense. And that's it. The Soviet government did support a lot of mountaineering clubs, a lot of outdoors clubs, a lot of explorers clubs. So, we've bashed the government in Russia quite a bit, but one of the things that they did was allow students like this real chances for adventure. So maybe one of the things that we could say that's positive about the students' sad end was that they did get the chance to take this adventure. It ended tragically, but they did have the chance, and that was thanks to, government support of these adventure programs.
And to your point, I think it's important because, like you said, you can't get into this kind of situation if you don't leave your house. And if you're, kicking around in 1959 in Soviet Russia, unless the government is giving you some ability to do this or offering something to you in the opportunity of this, like, this is not something you can just go out and do. And so to your point, like, yes, it is a positive that they were able to go out and do this. It's just, it's sad and it's unfortunate, and it wasn't Bigfoot and it wasn't aliens. So when can we just stop? Like, look, if you want to tell a fictional story about that, go for it. I think there's even a video game on PC that has Sean Bean narrating it that's set in the Dyatlov Pass. Like, that's, that they already want to do that. That's just go do that. Don't have to make the real story any more fantastical than it needs to. We can keep that to fiction, and it can be more fun that way.
I counted, by the way, Chris, if you want to do shows on them, I counted there are 2 fiction movies one with time travel and one with space aliens about Dyatlov Pass. So we can move on to those.
One with time travel, boy, they went back in time and murdered themselves.
It's the Soviet Groundhog Day, if I could describe the plot of that movie. I mean, everybody dies.
Wow.
And there's extreme violence, so it's the Soviet version of Groundhog Day.
Jesus.
But
I mean, it's like anything else. It's one of those things that's captured the public imagination, and it probably won't uncapture the public imagination, no matter what reasonable explanation the scientists give us, which I think is the harder to confront one, but it's the reasonable one that I like to believe. It's sad, but it's sad, and that's all you can say. So anything else we want to talk about with this or the movie or anything? Any musings or monologues anyone wants to have? Dr. Perlmutter, I know you prepared several monologues. I don't know if you'd gotten to them yet or not.
No, I just want to say I appreciate being here, and it's good to have these discussions where we talk not just about like an individual piece of cultural content, which I think all three of us can agree, for example, that it is very technically well done, but also the issues that are raised about like us as the audience. You know, I always tell my students, you have to be an active audience. You can't just let anything, whether it's a fiction, television series, set in the Star Wars universe, or the evening news, flow over you without asking some questions about how it's affecting you, what you appreciate, and also the truth value, either implied or directly claimed.
Yeah, I agree. Anything else we have? No? Okay. We'll get this out the door. So thank you both so much for joining me. I had a great time. Dr. Mullen, thank you for joining me for the first time. Dr. Perlmutter, thank you for joining me again and for picking the film and for inviting Dr. Mullen as well. It was a lot of fun. Like, rate, and review the show wherever you get it, more than likely on iTunes. Patreon.com/Kulturecast is where you can go to support the show. We do a weekly show or a monthly show about James Bond. That's only for Patreon supporters at the $5 and $10 level. Thank you both again so much for joining me, and make sure to check us out on the next episode.